Hello, welcome to the podcast from the Internationalist Workers Group, where we discuss current events in the United States and around the world from a Marxist and communist perspective. The IWG is the U.S. affiliate of the Internationalist Communist Tendency, which is an international organization for the constitution of an international working class party. We aim to provide not only information that would be relevant for the working class in the United States, but also criticism of the media and the coverage of events by bourgeois sources. Our intention is to discuss a broader range of issues in a less formal structure than would be found in our literature or periodicals. However, the topics we discuss will always be relevant to revolutionary working class politics and the criticism of the current state of affairs in this country and abroad. So, on the panel today, we have Andromeda.
Hello.
We have Tom.
Hi, everyone.
And myself, Seamus. And Aisha should be joining us shortly. But as we don't have a whole lot of time, why don't we just dive into topic number 1, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, I'm not sure how much you guys have looked into this, but seems to me that there's not going to be a whole lot of inflation reduction coming from this.
Yeah, that was something I kind of briefly read, that the Congressional Budget Office said that this actually isn't going to be much of a inflation reduction bill. But I didn't read much further into it.
The idea that the office of the presidency can control inflation is laughable. It's all just political spin. What it really was a spending bill, and Inflation Reduction Act is harder to smear politically for the current administration than calling it an EV tax credit and increased tax enforcement. And not that I'm advocating on behalf of the corporations and the bourgeoisie for their taxes, but I mean ultimately that really is the goal of this. But that's not what people care about. People care about inflation, so we'll put a propaganda name on a bill and send it through.
I mean, I was thinking about we're headed toward economic recession, or we're in a recession. I mean, as we discussed last time. Is this kind of a Keynesian type stimulus state spending bill, or is this more just trying to get some more revenue from taxes and that kind of thing from the bigger corporations?
I mean, a little bit of both. It feels very Obama era, very even kind of Clinton era. I feel like Keynesianism was the compromise that they started with and then compromised away from immediately. Because the first thing cut from this bill was any social spending that would benefit the working class. So before this was passed, it included universal preschool, paid family leave, and expanded child care aid, which were the provisions that were cut from the final bill. As always, that just shows that working class families are an afterthought for bourgeois politicians.
When reading up little summaries and news articles about this, something that really caught my attention was that it was compromised kind of based on Joe Manchin's whole thing, which I think we all understand that Joe Manchin kind of serves as the figurehead for the more right wing of the Democratic Party. But also the head of ExxonMobil praised the bill, saying that it was going into the right direction, which that's not a good sign for an environmental / improved infrastructure bill when you're getting praised by one of the chief causes of said climate disaster.
Well, that makes me, I hadn't seen that, but that makes me wonder if ExxonMobil is starting to get ready to pivot into so-called green energy sources. Because
that's happening in California right now with Toyota, because California just announced that they're going to be banning all new gas vehicles by 2035. And Gavin Newsom was like, yeah, we had some opposition from the automakers like Toyota, but now they all support it, which that's obviously kind of indicative of they are shifting their focus towards electric vehicles and the like, rather than this actually posing any threat to them.
Well, and Toyota was one of the early adopters of the electric vehicle also. So, I mean, that
And the
stands to
hybrid.
benefit their bottom line. And the most aggravating part of this whole discussion, the green spending in this bill for me, is that ultimately the carbon produced to manufacture the solar panels and the green cars, the EVs and the hybrids, all of that contributes to CO2 emissions vastly greater than those same vehicles, products, and services are going to offset. Because ultimately, the environmental crisis that we're living through right now is a crisis of capital. It's not a crisis of personal responsibility. So we have this kind of these tax rebates that are kind of irrelevant to people who are struggling economically right now, which is most of the working class. And then we have these corporations that stand to benefit from them, from what increased spending goes to them in the form of tax rebates and write-offs and stuff.
Hello, Aisha.
Hi, Aisha.
Hey, Aisha. So we're discussing the Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah. So, Tom, you made the point about the climate crisis as being a crisis of capital, and I think that's entirely true. Not only that, we have this bill, kind of talking about ExxonMobil as well, these people being happy about it. I think a big reason for that is that all of the lands and offshore waters that could go to renewable firms are opened up for oil and gas drilling as well. So oil and gas production could go, through the roof with this. They're happy about that. I think it's absolutely naive to look from an environmental perspective to look at this as any kind of victory, because oil and gas have huge advantage over acquiring these lands and offshore territories over the renewable firms. There's going to be a lot of costs associated with setting up whatever equipment they need for instance, if you're a renewable firm, a wind farm, or if you're an oil and gas company, a drilling rig. As far as costs go, I'm not sure which is more, but the fact is oil and gas just have so much more liquid capital that they can just throw the money out there, get all their equipment set up, and produce more oil and gas. That's just going to add to the climate problems.
If I may kind of generalize this entire situation, this bill, I remember when it got passed or when Biden signed it, a lot of the media was heralding it as this is revolutionary. This is going to be its legacy. And I remember reading a summary of it, and I just thought to myself, this is yes, they are technically correct that this is the biggest bill for climate change ever, but given that this country is the United States and how much money we really have, that really comes off as kind of vapid and devoid of any meaning. Because this bill is a beautiful testament to compromise and this idea that it's everyone's individual responsibility rather than actually going after the entities and people who put the most carbon into the air. And the reason why we have wildfires every summer and why our rivers are drying up and why our valleys are getting flooded. It's a bill that is premised on giving carrots to these companies rather than any stick. It's all about incentives for them to do better. You can be better, ExxonMobil, rather than just punishing them or preventing them from doing any damaging actions in the first place.
Well, except the working class isn't doing enough. Like, because we don't have solar panels and we're not investing in wind farms, and my car still runs on gasoline because I can't afford something new. So, like, for us, it's a moral, like, climate change is a moral failure. But for the bourgeoisie, it's just not a solid enough investment opportunity right now. And they just need to be incentivized because we all know they can make the right decisions.
This topic in particular gets me very heated. Don't even get me started on like the individual responsibility placed on working class people. Like, for one, the plastic tax. In New York now, they banned plastic a year or two ago. And I've been having to pay extra for grocery bags ever since. And it hasn't reduced my plastic usage at all. If anything, it's just increased the amount of money I spend on groceries. Meanwhile, you see like companies literally dumping out like toxic waste into the oceans, or getting rid of waste. Really, waste to the ruling class is just things that are perfectly usable but no longer profitable. Like tomatoes that are bruised, for example. Perfectly, you could still eat them, but it's not profitable. So we have tons of like food waste. We have tons of just so much waste, and it's. I'm so sick of the ruling class creating the narrative as if us normal working class people are responsible for the nearly even like a fraction of the amount that even just one bourgeois person produces. Did you hear about the whole thing where celebrities were doing like very short private jet?
I was just about to bring that up. I think people are waking up, and like being online only tells us so much. And when that came out, that like Taylor Swift would just take a helicopter to fly 20 minutes, people were pissed. And like, of course, it was like with a bunch of cynical snark. But you mentioned the plastics thing, and I remember this one TikTok where it was like, it was Walter White screaming in the little hole he was in that one episode, with the caption saying something about how I have to use these shitty paper straws, but Taylor Swift is allowed to like fly 5 minutes to get groceries at Whole Foods in a helicopter.
Oh, every time I have to use a paper straw, my class hatred goes through the roof on the spot.
I don't even use straws anymore.
Are the worst.
I just drink it out of my cup.
I
just drink it out of my cup now.
But the thing is, you can't even recycle that paper, can you? Because I heard like if it's already wet or something, like you can't even recycle it. So like, what is the point?
Decompose.
It's the same. It's the same thing with pizza boxes, not recyclable because there's too much oil in it. And then like I think like another area of this that we as internationalists need to look at is one, acknowledging that the bourgeoisie is international as well. And they're aware of this, but 2/3 of carbon emissions are coming from the developing world. So no matter what is done in a single nationality, like a single nation state, it's ultimately not going to be enough. And so like right now, like what I see when I look at Biden's bill is like a kind of like snide cash grab to create a new marketplace. And like maybe that's how they thought that they would adjust inflation. But like the bourgeois class knows like as a group that things like this aren't adequate, and they don't care because of 4-year election cycles and the impossibility of reasonably managed like international policy under capital.
I agree with what you were saying, Tom, and I think it's really just any climate change bill is none of it, like no matter how quote unquote radical it may seem, is going to change anything with the climate problem, because reformism is not the answer to climate change. So the only solution is to abolish capitalism entirely, because the reason why like things are so bad is because of the constant accumulation of capital and using and the fact that these companies and the ruling class are really just so profit driven. It doesn't matter just how much we try to, recycle or stop littering or whatever they want to tell us workers to do. None of that is going to change anything if we still live in a capitalist system.
That's a huge point. And as far as accumulation goes, that can't be stopped within the system. You can't manage that away. The capitalist has to accumulate more and more to get the edge over the other capitalist. And eventually you just produce so much that you are struggling to get profit out of every last natural resource there is. So while that includes human resources, as in the working class in this particular system, it also are natural resources that are in the ground, underwater, that require the destruction of the ecosystems. And it's just not something that any piece of legislation can get rid of.
Nope. This one is up to the working class. And
Exactly.
I think as a matter of perspective, it's easy to get real depressed about this topic real fast. But as long as there's the possibility for class solidarity and a working class political movement, then there's a possibility for the earth.
Exactly. Also, do you guys remember in August 2021 when there was the leaked draft of the IPCC report on climate change that was supposed to be released in 2022? Do you guys remember when that happened?
I do remember that.
I don't actually.
Okay, so basically what happened was a group of scientists that were working with the Spanish branch of Scientist Rebellion, which was an offshoot of Extinction Rebellion. They decided to leak the draft because of the fear that governments would water down their conclusions before the set publication date. And so since governments have a right to make the changes for the summary for policymaker section, it was a likely possibility. So the contents of the report basically confirmed the fact that capitalist accumulation is responsible for the drastic rise in carbon emissions over the last few decades. And on par with technological advancements that have been made since the 1970s, emissions have steadily increased, as well as energy consumption and overproduction. So that itself is a natural consequence of an economic system that's based on capital accumulation and profit-driven production. So basically, the report confirmed the fact that the bourgeoisie is responsible for the majority of carbon emissions. It didn't say that outright, in terms of the bourgeoisie, the way that we would say it. But the statistics and everything that was reported in the report was basically saying that it was the ruling class who was responsible for it.
Yeah.
It basically said how the top 10% of emitters on a global scale are also part of the world's wealthiest 10%. And they contribute between 36 to 45% of emissions, which is 10 times the rate of emissions contributed by the poorest 10% of people, globally, who only contribute 3 to 5% of emissions. And the top 1% is also responsible for 50% of emissions resulting from aviation.
And aviation is a huge contributor. I mean, that's kind of why everybody was so upset. Well, I don't know if that's exactly why. I think it was more just the brazenness of a celebrity just casually taking a helicopter ride. But if we're looking at this from, why that means so much to a person who values an intact environment, aviation emissions are extremely high, especially when it's compared to like cars and various transits, like ground transit. So, I mean, that's sort of saying, if you have the ability to just willy-nilly go around, fly your helicopter or your private jet whenever you want for like really kind of petty reasons, I guess, then that demands a response. Like, I know we were previously talking about more of an emotional kind of, you're angry about it, which that's good in a sense, but of course, as from the communist perspective, we should be driving that towards a more organized movement against capital.
Exactly.
And pushing for the party.
Absolutely.
Yes, of course. Always the party. Also, like, in order to prevent total environmental catastrophe, global warming cannot exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius more than pre-industrial levels. So that would require us to cut emissions significantly within the next decade. But the interests of the capitalist class are completely antithetical to this aim. Because of like the global economy's reliance on fossil fuels as a means to generate the most profit, that itself will make it impossible to keep global warming from reaching the higher limit of 2 degrees Celsius.
Well,
Like sorry to interrupt.
Oh,
It's just that like if it does go to this point, like a lot of bad things are gonna happen. Natural disasters are gonna get worse. We're gonna have way more extreme weather, heat waves, more hurricanes, tornadoes, and emperor penguins are gonna go extinct too. We're gonna go extinct.
Well, hundreds of animal species go extinct every year, and we don't hear anything about it. And as a huge appreciator of rhinoceroses, like this quiet whimper of the white rhino, like it hits home for me. But like normally though, like what's actually meant when people bring that up is more like insects and stuff, but that's like the basis of the food chain, and it's going to have far-reaching consequences. And if they really wanted to invest in technologies that were capable of mitigating some of this, there are theoretical carbon neutralizing technologies, but the investment is going to have to be in the billions, and there's not a marketplace for it. So instead, we get a half measure right out of the gate from the administration. We're not pursuing carbon neutralization. We're pursuing electronic vehicles and wind farms and
the veneer of pursuing
and solar panels, just to make people feel better about the slow demise of our planet.
If I may, because I think we need to kind of wrap this up if we want to move on to our other topics and give them a decent amount of time. If I kind of can end this with a quote from William S. Burroughs that I heard a while back that's kind of stuck in my head for a long time. It goes like this: desperation is raw material for drastic change. Only those who can leave behind everything they have ever believed in have a hope to escape. So, all of this is quite upsetting and quite nerve-wracking. But I think it's important for us to understand that this reckoning is kind of necessary. People kind of do need to wake up to the devastation we have wrought upon ourselves and the inadequacies of the current political and social systems that proclaim that they are able to fix this problem. And, maybe it will take a lot more for people to wake up and realize what we are doing to ourselves. But my kind of point is that at the end of the day, we kind of live in the society that we deserve, not necessarily the one that we need. And that, socialism or barbarism, if people decide to choose barbarism, I mean, well, that's kind of just the way it'll have to go.
I don't.
Yeah,
so that's the point exactly. The point I'm trying to make is that it is our task now to use this impending collapse into our propaganda and agitation among the least conscious among us, and to get people to understand that there really to get them to understand that you have to abandon everything that you have ever known in order to have any hope of escape.
I get what you mean. Sorry. You can go.
Okay, I'd say the only thing I would modify in what you said there, Andromeda, is that this is being done to us. Like,
Yeah.
as we don't own property, we don't own capital, we can't drive how things are done, how things are produced, and how devastating they are. I mean, you're right, we do need a conscious movement from the working class to end this, but I would hesitate to say that, like, we all get what we deserve in that sense. Like,
You're right. I should have modified my statement. When I said that, I was more talking about I don't know, it was a little bit kind of doomerish of me. I guess my whole thing is like, there is the fate of history is up to us.
I get what you mean.
Regardless.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was just like, modify my statement. I don't believe that we, as the vast majority of civilization and of society, have wrought this upon ourselves. This was imposed upon us, but it is now our duty, it is our historical task to work to abolish it. I guess that's kind of what I mean by we'll get what we deserve. If we work hard enough to actually build a movement, we will save ourselves from extinction. And if we don't, well, then everyone goes down with the ship.
Yeah. Okay. I get what you mean. I was just going to agree with Seamus's point. Like I know your clarification does make more sense. Initially, I was going to say that like I don't think that the working class should be held responsible for the actions of the ruling class, but I think we're on the same page.
Yeah. I'm sorry if I worded that weirdly. I was trying to make it fit with the quote.
It's okay. I understood what you meant. Oh, one more thing. If you guys want to know more about the IWG's stance on climate change, we do have a broadsheet called Internationalist Notes. In issue 3, we have a article on climate change about our class position on it. This was written a year ago. Well, not a year ago. 2022, half a year ago. So this is from January, but I think it's still very relevant now. There's just been more climate events that have happened since, but the analysis is still our position. So if you want to see that, go to leftcom.org.
There's also a great little pamphlet by Stefanini called I believe it's called Capitalism and Environment. That's from 2009, but kind of gives a broad overview about there's no such thing as green capitalism. It will drive us to complete barbarism.
Yeah, if we're talking about that, I have a whole rant about how green capitalism is
the Green New Deal.
Yeah, that won't help anything either. But I think we do need to move on to the next topic because we're running a bit low on time.
Sri Lanka. I kind of spent my entire afternoon reading through the timeline of events that you can find online. So that being said, I guess I should introduce this topic. I believe a lot of us are familiar with what happened on, I believe it was July 9th. Let me just check to make sure. Yes, July 9th, in which video and photographs coming from Sri Lanka show protesters storming the presidential secretariat, which is basically the office of the president and his administration, as well as the presidential residence itself. And this is all just kind of introduction to what has been going on in Sri Lanka since 2019, and more specifically, the protests that have been going on since March of this year. And so I know we have to worry about time, so I'm just going to kind of briefly overview through the background and the two main factors for the causes of these protests. The first one being Sri Lanka has been in an insane economic crisis all the way from 2019. And there have been a variety of factors that have contributed to that. Principal among them is just a large amount of foreign debt. I believe by February of this year, Sri Lanka had about $2.3 billion in reserves, yet they had a bill to pay of $4 billion. And a lot of this is coming from foreign loans that they took out, especially from the Asia Development Bank, which holds 13% of that debt, Japan and China, which each hold 10% of that debt too. And as of 2021, the debt was around 10% of its GDP. And if this wasn't bad enough, the presidential administration in Sri Lanka kind of exacerbated the situation by a series of fiscal policies. One of them was to create tax cuts, and another one which was to just begin printing more and more money, which naturally decreased revenue for the government and also increased inflation for the country. In 2019, COVID-19 happened, and they also had the Easter massacre, in which 258 people were just killed in a bombing at a church. And that really put an end to tourism for a while, which was a major source for foreign currency reserves. Those have since dried up. But more recently, there's also been the Russo-Ukrainian war, which has cut off Sri Lanka a lot from its food supply and also its source of energy. So kind of just tying that back into the previous episode about how the Russo-Ukrainian war is not an intranational conflict, it is an international phenomenon as well. And all of this served to kind of highlight to the people of Sri Lanka the ruling family that has been in control of the island for the past couple decades, which is the Rajapaksas. The family holds a lot of political power in Sri Lanka. There's this article by France 24, which kind of goes over each member of the family, what their job in the current government, or I should say former government, was, and like each of their little controversies. Of course, I can't go into too much time of that, so I'm just going to say generally characterized as corrupt, a lot of nepotism, and just generally incompetent. So kind of with all that being said, and I'll touch upon more if you have any questions. I'm kind of just moving on. Oh, I should also mention, the family was indicted in the Pandora Papers. Do any of you remember that?
Oh, yes. Oh, do you mean the Panama Papers or?
Panama Papers, right?
No, the Pandora
the
Papers.
Pandora Papers?
I
think I've only heard of the Panama Papers.
It was very similar to the Panama Papers. There was another leak, but it basically implicated the Rajapaksas of having a bunch of offshore shell corporations, which they used to stash their wealth from outside of Sri Lanka.
Oh, that's a tale as old as time right there.
Yeah. But again, this is in light of the economic crisis. And so, kind of we then move on to March, in which we start to see the very beginnings of this protest, which start out very humbly in the form of these little candlelit marches and vigils that, over time just grew more and more. This timeline is very long and kind of exhaustive, but I'll go over just the major beats. It starts out in March with a bunch of small scale protests all across the country, and they are not really recognized by the MPs and the members of parliament, so they begin to increase. By mid to late March, there's an increase in action. The largest opposition party in Sri Lanka demands the president to resign outside of the presidential residence. And the members of the family had to cancel an opening ceremony at a sports stadium because of protests there. On March 31st is when we begin to see the Sri Lankan government crack down with the stick and fire tear gas and water cannons at protesters, after which declaring to the media that they were militant extremists. But in a nice act of solidarity, after a bunch of them were arrested, 300 lawyers came to offer to defend them pro bono, which is kind of like a nice little thing to hear about. In April, a state of emergency is declared, and the protests begin to expand in the amount of people and the types of people. We see carpenters, drivers for private buses, and fishermen join. And a 36-hour curfew is then announced, which ends up kind of biting them in the ass because that just led to a lot of panic buying in a nation that is already having a lot of food shortages, which only ended up emboldening a lot of the protests.
I did have a quick question. Like, when you say private bus drivers, are these people who own the buses themselves, or so are they like?
That was not mentioned specifically. When they say private bus drivers, I assume they're talking about like those coach buses that, like in the United States, we have those Flex buses and Greyhound.
Right. Okay.
That's what I assume they mean by private bus drivers, like non-public transportation workers.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you mean.
But again, they didn't really specify the class composition of them. So maybe there might be some owner-operators, but I'm willing to assume that not a lot of them are.
I was wondering the same thing, Seamus. Honestly, all of the careers involved could kind of be characterized as the petit bourgeois, depending on exactly the nature of like the carpenter's work as well. And like lawyers are like, along with physicians, like the original petit bourgeois from like the 1800s.
Yeah, I should mention right now, I don't want to characterize this as a purely working class movement. If anything, I would describe it as a quote unquote popular movement. But by virtue of it being a popular movement, that means you are going to get members of proletariat as well. And these protests are wide scale. I'm going to talk about right now. We start to see these occupation of public, what would you call it? Like land, like the area outside of the presidential secretariat and I think the largest park in Sri Lanka. And they start setting up these kind of makeshift protest villages, very similar in vein to like Chaz or Occupy.
Mm-hmm.
And it is in these that they actually do have these kind of mutual aid centers where they're collecting food, collecting water, collecting fuel, and even have people with medical experience giving out services for free.
Oh, that's interesting to hear. I hadn't heard about that.
That was an interesting
this movement
thing.
At all.
Yeah, it was very interesting to read about because it was at a place called Gale Face Green, which is, I saw pictures of it, kind of just like a long stretch of yard and lawn. And they essentially set up these little villages.
So that kind of indicates to me that there was there like some degree of involvement from the leftists.
Okay,
because those are such similar, like such familiar tactics.
I'm glad you bring that up. I remember reading a newspaper article that says that most of the protesters actually consider themselves apolitical, like they don't attach themselves to a political party. But I know from the WSWS website, the SEP, the Socialist Equality Party, that they actually did have their Sri Lanka party present and that there were people there. But this is a popular protest, which means like every opposition party is kind of just joining along in it. So yes, there was
opportunistically.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is like a popular protest because I was reading also a lot of small businesses are being affected by this, and so like they can't really like feed their families right now. They're basically, I think the issue that's going on is a lot of petit bourgeois are becoming proletarianized because of this inflation. Yeah,
and I kind of wrote like a 2-paragraph like final 2 cents about this when I get to the end of this timeline, which I'm about halfway through. I'll quicken it up so that we can actually get to other things. On April 20th, there is a strike, a 1-day general strike in which over 1,000 different unions participate, ranging from teachers' unions, oil workers, and medical staff. And I also remember reading about a hospital whose entire staff went on a walkout in order to protest the conditions and the demand for the resignation of the president. I apologize if I'm a little rambly. This protest has been going on for so long, and a lot has happened, and the timeline I was reading kind of did just go over every minute detail. So I'm kind of speaking from memory and speaking from my notes.
No problem.
Eventually, the president, I think the most important thing to mention is that July 9th, the president does flee. And I believe a couple months prior to that, a lot of the Rajapaksa members of the family resigned from their high-level positions in the government. And some of them stayed resigned, and others were basically just assigned to smaller, less departments with less eyes on them. But all throughout this time, the government is kind of cracking down very hard. They are using a lot of tear gas and a lot of water cannons on protesters. And on May 11th, even the military is deployed with a shoot-on-sight order, and they were given authority to arrest without a warrant and search residences without a warrant as well. There was also one report I saw where loyalists to the government were trying to incite religious/ethnic conflict between the Muslim population and the Sinhalese people. And also in an interesting act of kind of solidarity, violence was actually averted through a combined effort of Catholic nuns trying to keep the peace and people taking to social media basically saying that this is all bullshit. We're not trying to harm these other communities. Don't believe their lies. And so with that, conflict was averted, which was an interesting thing to read about.
I mean, that's another classic tactic from ruling classes.
Yeah.
Exploit the otherness, and we even talked about that last time in the Ukrainian conflict. Religion in that region is, of course, a very, that's a point.
Tamil, yeah, and ethnic, especially. The entire civil war was based on ethnic tensions between Tamil ethnicity and the other different groups that are living on Sri Lanka. There was also Black Monday, which happened on May 9th, in which basically a bunch of people were just beaten by the military and police who tried to storm the little villages of Gotagama, which is in their language stands for Gotta Go Gama Village, or Gota, because that's the first name of the president. But anyway, deployment of the military, there was the No Deal Gama, which was made in response to not the resignation of the president, but to opposition PMs basically were seen leaving the parliament and the presidential secretariat, which led protesters to believe that they were trying to strike a deal with them. But I want to jump kind of to the aftermath of storming the presidential residence and the exile of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, because they also kind of established a little village within the presidential residence. They created a library with books in all the different languages that are spoken in Sri Lanka. And they even kind of opened it up as a tourist spot so that people could see the luxury that the president and his family were living in while the rest of the nation had to deal with blackouts and food shortages and medical shortages. One terrifying story I read was about how critical surgeries just had to be canceled and people were dying, like not even on the operating table, just because of these blackouts and a lack of medical supplies. Anyway, the president flees the country. He resigns on the 14th, and a new president is ushered in. That president's name is it's hard for me to keep all these names together because I just am very unfamiliar with the language. Ranil Wickremesinghe was officially sworn in as acting president on the 15th, and the protesters renamed Gotta Go Gama to Ranil Go Gama, which basically means Ranil needs to go village, and they demanded that he resigns as well. But after this, it really is kind of all down here, and I'll talk about that in my little analysis. Police begin to get more forceful with these raids. with military and special forces also being involved, people getting beat up, people getting attacked. And, by August 10th, most of the villages, including the village at Galefase Green, was vacated. And so I kind of just bring it to the end there. And I just read today on CNN that the president, or the former president, Rajapaksa, intends to come back to Sri Lanka by the end of the week. And so that kind of leaves me with my analysis. And there's a lot I had to skip over just for the sake of time so we can get to our other topic and make sure that everyone can leave at a reasonable time. I would encourage the listener to actually look for a timeline of events and look for just the various different instances that we saw, including, I totally skipped over this, but there were loyalist members of the ruling party and even some MPs who kind of stormed the Gadagogama and attacked people, and the protesters responded by basically throwing them into the lake and screaming at them that they should go to come rescue them, and then setting their trucks on fire. Which was that was kind of the most violence that the protesters inflicted upon the loyalist faction that was trying to support the president. And yeah, I'm just to kind of get to my analysis, I kind of wrote this little paragraph. When reading this about these protests, it was kind of overwhelming just about how much there was. And while there was a lot of hope in reading this, there was also, you could kind of tell that it was not going to be able to hold this momentum for so long. For the same reason I kind of mentioned earlier, it was very much modeled after Occupy. It was very much modeled after Chaz. And those movements did die down because they didn't really have a revolutionary platform. All the demands from these protests, from what I could see, were just two. They wanted the resignation of the president, and they wanted to add a new amendment to the Constitution, disallowing dual citizens from holding high positions of power. And that's not really enough. That none of those plans are actually fix the economic situation in Sri Lanka. I think the economic crisis and the corruption of the ruling family, in a way, kind of did a disservice to any revolutionary organization there, because you could just say, well, it's because the corrupt Rajapaksas are in power. And that's true, but those Rajapaksas they did not get into power just through the sheer will of like their family ambition. They were operating under a certain framework, a liberal capitalist framework. And it was through that framework that they were allowed to keep power, and they were allowed to wield authority like they were. And none of the demands of the protesters overall really sought to change anything about that. And you guys pointed it out, but this was not a working class solely movement. This was a quote unquote popular movement in which we had small business owners, and we had opposition party members of bourgeois parties participate. And when that happens, you kind of lose a sense of direction. You kind of lose an identity when you have such a broad set of demands. This is a widespread popular protest, but because a lot of the protesters did not see themselves as political, they didn't have much in a way of any foundational changes. They demanded for the resignation of the ruling family and their cronies and an amendment in the Constitution, which would leave any fundamental elements of their government unchanged. There were some genuinely inspiring moments of solidarity between the various groups of the island, such as a remembrance vigils for everyone killed during the Civil War, and solidarity among the various ethnic and religious groups. There was also hope in the mutual aid that existed in these makeshift villages. The occupation of the presidential palace and the establishment of a library and tourist site, as protesters could see the luxury of their ruling class lived in, is also potential for class consciousness. It reminds me a lot of Chaz and Occupy, but ultimately those movements failed because they lost momentum in the face of having no real revolutionary demands. Already we are seeing these protests slow down. Several of these villages have been vacated by force with the police and military, including the one at Galipas Green. These protests still are ongoing, but they highlight, for us, it is important to us that they highlight the need for a revolutionary vanguard to establish itself before the situation gets to this point, and direct and help educate the least politically conscious members of their class towards a more revolutionary goal. And that's kind of, that was the end of my little paragraph I wrote.
Thank you for that, Andromeda. That's a really good point, and I'm glad that you bring up the point about it being the protesters primarily being apolitical and them not really having any revolutionary demands. Like the fact that it is, consisted of people from multiple different backgrounds and like different class backgrounds shows that like it is a popular movement, like you said, and that is essentially why it died down. It's I like the comparison you made to Occupy and Chaz because that was pretty similar in the sense that it's if you don't have workers organizing like around their common class interests specifically, then what is really your end goal? Because it's not going to lead to internationalist revolution in that way. And even though I think it is like a good sign that people were protesting, because like the reason why this like protest came about, like not just the electoralism, like nepotism issues that were going on, it's also very much tied to inflation, the war going on in Ukraine, and just like internationally, like all of it's connected. The war in Ukraine has like had like a negative effect on Sri Lanka's economy, and the inflation costs have like the inflation has increased, and along with everything that you said, the economic side of it also drives people to want to protest. And what I had mentioned with the small businesses failing, with like the petite bourgeoisie becoming proletarianized, that is like a phenomenon that's taking place in like a lot of countries. And it's really good that you mentioned how it's necessary for us to really have to voice our demands, because like if a protest is not really organized like in that way with a specific like class demands that we're having, it's not going to actually lead to anything. Like what they're demanding is really just going to push for another election or something, or like support for the opposition, the opposing political party. And it's really just like the same electoral like same electoral bullshit that happens in so many other countries, like in Algeria, in Bangladesh, Pakistan.
To your point about Aisha, to your point about it's not enough for an internationalist revolution or an international revolution. It's not enough for even a meaningful change in the local government or their national government, I should say.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
It's the same system, and a single amendment to the Constitution, which is the demand itself, is so like specifically against that ruling family. Yeah, you're going to keep that family out now, but I think they are just left back into their into the same way of doing things, which is that's sort of the easy way to end a quote unquote revolution. But I think I'll just leave it with this. There was another sort of nationalist, not nationalist, but there was some other protest I was having a discussion with some leftists about, and it was, if you're communist and you don't care about like making this one country better, then why even participate? The reason why we participate in these struggles, and I don't, by participate I don't mean like we go for the goals that are not demanded by the working class, but we are there, we're in the milieu, so to speak. In that way, we can identify proletarian elements that have been sort of swallowed up by these more popular movements.
There was that line in the Communist Manifesto that said that the proletarian revolution will be national in its form, but international in its character. So with that being said, it is imperative that you do kind of show yourself in these national movements. But the point of that is to divert it and direct people to understand that their interests are not national, they are international.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was getting to. But no, I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's totally true. And sort of further, another thing mentioned in the manifesto is that communists do not seek to conceal their aims, and they should. And at this point, especially when there's this kind of mass movement going on, we have to be out there with our aims. And I know, the ICT itself probably doesn't have any contacts with anybody in Sri Lanka, as far as I know, but I think it's a lesson. We see the progression of this, and I actually do appreciate you going over the whole timeline of this, because you see the progression of this, and then you get to the end, and it's just like, just back to the same old,
Yeah, I actually did feel really disappointed when I got to like that last couple paragraphs, and it was like, yeah, Galay Fase, Green was completely evacuated by August 10th.
Well,
But again, like, it's not surprising when you take into account everything else that had happened previously. Like, I don't know, it's also like the George Floyd protest, where they did some pretty amazing things. They stormed the presidential palace. They got their president to have to fly and leave the country. But at the end of the day, they didn't really know what to do once they got in there.
Yeah, because it's not really about the president himself. Like, you can have like a completely different president that's like supports like the opposing viewpoints. Like, you can literally have a president who calls himself a socialist, and it's still not going to change anything, because it's not about the president who is in power. It is the system itself.
I know we need to move on to our last topic, but if I can just kind of close out on a positive note, this was very much a useful thing for the Sri Lankan working class, and just for Sri Lankans in general, to understand that they do have power. There is power in numbers. There is strength in unity. It's just now a matter of getting them to unite around an actual revolutionary platform.
Well, and that can be motivated and driven by the memory of the working class. And I'm gonna format my thoughts here in like a more positive manner than I normally do, because this was such a massive like mobilization of people. Instead of criticizing them for these things, like there's the seed here to grow from, to learn from. That spontaneity can't solve these issues. Like, organization is necessary. It's the same thing that caused the downfall of the Chaz and Occupy. Like, when you have spontaneous movements erupt with no direction from a communist organization or from the Communist Party in the future, when such a thing exists, it automatically puts a limitation on the actions that can be taken and the results that can be obtained. And, not every mobilization of people is going to result in like even a Stalinized national, like, managed economy, let alone like an international communism. But this is steps like this like linger in the memory of the working class, what worked and what didn't. And even if the end result was just a regime change in name only, because I believe it was purely a prime minister who left and the new one has ties to the previous one, like the memory of this, it can linger, and it will linger in the consciousness of Sri Lankan people.
Yeah, and I like the way that you talk about, it's kind of it's about the friends made along the way in this instance, and it's about the memory that is created.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. You've been listening to the podcast from the IWG, the Leftcom cast. Hope you've learned something and become a little bit more conscious of what's going on. And we will talk with you next time. All right. See you, everyone.
Bye,
Have a nice
guys.
day.